Good morning. Bienvenue à cette conférence de presse
Welcome to this press conference
about the radioactive waste mount at Chalk River. Miss Elizabeth May, you can go.
Thank you. I'm honored to be a sponsor for this morning's press conference, but I'll turn it over to the leadership here from various Algonquin nations and from the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation Tribal Council. I'll turn it over to you, Chief.
So, Quay, hello, good morning. My name is Lance Heyman. I'm Chief of the Quebec First Nation, one of the 11 Algonquin First Nations whose people live in the Ottawa River watershed since time immemorial. I'm pleased to share the podium this morning with Elizabeth May, my fellow chiefs, and we want to, speak about the nuclear pollution that is occurring at Chalk River and is only going to get progressively worse. In our language, the Ottawa River is called Kitchissippi, or the Great River in English. Kitchissippi is sacred to our peoples and is the heart of our unceded homeland. Our land has never been surrendered through treaty, and our people have never consented to the nuclearization of the Chalk River site for the past 75 years. As many of you know, during this time there have been 2 serious nuclear accidents. The site has been severely contaminated with radioactive materials that will be dangerous for all forms of life far into the future. Now the Government of Canada, through the private sector contractor, is proposing and promoting a giant radioactive waste mound or a nuclear waste dump less than 1 kilometer from the Ottawa River. In our view, this is insanity to put such a deadly waste in a huge pile on top of a mound right beside a river. Studies show that the mound would leak during and after construction, and after a few hundred years it is even expected to degrade due to erosion and other natural processes. Canadian Nuclear Laboratory's own studies predict this. We and our sister First Nations, Kitigan, Zibi, and Anishinaabe, have been involved in the consultations with the dump proponent and the nuclear regulator for the past year. These consultations seem to have been an afterthought for the promoters of this dump. The consultations with us began after the final licensing hearing for the facility in June of 2022. Our team has done detailed ground truthing on the site where CNL wants to put the giant dump. The team learned a great deal on visits to the site this past winter and spring. They collected samples for analysis, identified an endangered tree species, set up webcams, and took drone footage. Their discoveries about the wildlife and endangered species living on the proposed dump site are very interesting and important. It is shocking to us that the proponent never did the research and seemed unaware of these things. Our team's findings are summarized in this booklet. I have some copies to share, and it'll also be available after on our website. I'd like to be clear. The Quebec First Nation does not consent to the construction of the radioactive waste dump on our unceded territory. We believe that the consultation process has been inadequate and that our Indigenous rights are threatened by this proposal. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People says that Indigenous people must provide their free, prior, and informed consent before radioactive waste is stored or disposed of in their territory. We have not given our consent. Many of you may have seen last week there was an announcement by CNSC in that it had signed an agreement and had received consent from the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan. It's a rather, a tough situation, and we're kind of, feeling hurt in that they would, proceed, to give consent when they are only but one voice of the Algonquin Nation. We represent the other 10 communities of our nation, and we are here, to unequivocally speak to the fact that we do not support and will not provide consent for this project. Quebec First Nation is calling for the NSDF project at Chalk River to be cancelled. The focus at Chalk River must be to shift to real cleanup of this site that does not leave a toxic legacy. In closing, I just want to, remind everyone, especially, people, Canadians living here in the Ottawa area. This nuclear site is already leaching radioactive pollution into the Ottawa River in the form of tritium, which is radioactive hydrogen. And it's only going to get progressively worse. And there's no treatment for tritium. So CNL and CNSC will tell you that they are going to build a treatment plant. But, in our world, we've learned that you never build your treatment plant above where you collect your drinking water. And this is precisely what CNSC is going to do. They're going to build a water treatment plant to try and eradicate iridium out of the radioactive water. And then they're going to put it into the Ottawa River where all the folks here in Ottawa are going to be drinking it. We need to wake up, take our head out of the sand and recognize what a danger Chalk River poses, not only to the Algonquin and the Anishinaabe people, but to all Canadians, especially those living in the Ottawa-Gatineau area. I'll now turn the mic over to Chief White Duck. Thank you.
You've got Chief Heyman. Kwekakana. Minawshiba. Ogama Wabashishib, Indigenous, Kitigan Zibi, Nindonjiba. Greetings, everyone. My name is Dylan White Duck. I'm Chief of Kitigan Zibi Anishinaabe, and it's an important matter to be speaking on this here today. Along with Quebec First Nation, we were singled out last year for consultation after the final license and hearing for the nuclear waste dump wrapped up in June of 2022. We have many concerns about this proposed nuclear waste facility called the NSDF. We are concerned about the site for the proposed dump. At no time in our consultations has anyone provided any justification for putting it so close to the Kitchissippi. We have received no satisfactory explanation for why other sites well away from the river were not considered. We are concerned about the type of facility. In our view, a landfill doesn't make sense for radioactive material that will be hazardous for thousands of years. We are concerned about the addition of the new harmful impacts that this may cause on top of existing effects from the 75 years of nuclear initiatives at this site. The Chalk River nuclear site was created without free prior consent and informed consent. We have never agreed to this, and it continues to be operated on the unceded territory. We have consistently expressed our opposition to further nuclear development in our Algonquin territory. We are concerned that the CRL, the site, is contaminating the surrounding lands and waters with radiation and other hazardous materials. We worry about the radioactive materials getting into our air, our sacred waters, and affecting the wildlife and health of our peoples. We are concerned that the deforestation and blasting to create the new dumps threaten endangered species, such as the wolves, Blandings, turtles, and the black ash trees, all of which are potentially species at risk. And we are concerned about losing a loss of a spiritual site that is very important to us, such as the Oiseau Rock, which is referred to as settlers as Bird Rock. In Algonquin, it's known as the Migizi Kishikabenkan, a point at Buptin due to the nuclear hazard. In our final joint submission with Quebec First Nation, we point out that the federal government has failed its duty to consult with us. We also point out that approving this dump would violate UNDRIP, the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as already mentioned by Chief Lance Heyman. And in conclusion, I echo Chief Heyman's statement that we do not consent with the construction of the NSDF in our territory. We believe that consultation has been inadequate and that our Indigenous rights are threatened by this proposal. Thank you for hearing me out, and this is a grave concern for our people and our nation. We do not consent to this, as Chief Lance Heyman referred to, and we need to be properly consulted with respect to UNDRIP and all those who are moving along this process without prior consent. Miigwech for hearing me out, and I hope you understand our concerns for the future of our territory.
Kwekakana, good morning. Savannah McGregor, and Indigenous cause. My name is Savannah McGregor. I'm from Kitigan-Zibi Anishinaabeg, and I am the Grand Chief of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg Nation Tribal Council. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to share our perspective as Anishinaabe people and our concerns about the proposed nuclear waste dump. I'll start with a bit of history. For over a century, Canada's Aboriginal policy was aimed at eliminating our governance systems, extinguishing our rights, disregarding our treaties, and assimilating our people into settler society. We have faced intergenerational trauma, displacement from our unceded territory, and historical exclusion from decision-making at the Chalk River laboratory site. Canada's colonial policies have contributed to the ongoing discrimination faced by our people. However, we are resilient. We continue to resist colonial erasure. We are actively working at revitalizing our traditional knowledge, language, practices, and laws. To do this revitalization work, we must connect with the land, as it forms a central part of our Anishinaabe identity. The Algonquin people have a stewardship vision for our lands and waters. We aim to ensure that all forms of life can live free from threats and potential harm across generations, 7 to be exact, in a healthy and safe environment. In our Anishinaabe tradition, women are keepers of the waters and men are keepers of the fire. Men's fire-keeping teachings include the earth's internal fire. Traditional knowledge teaches that the heat from the burying of nuclear waste would change the earth's internal fire, and that the nuclear energy leaching into the water and then flowing into living forms would disturb all life. But no Algonquin communities were ever consulted about the construction of the Chalk River nuclear site. Now, our communities are expected to accept in our territory the waste that this facility has generated, as well as other wastes brought in from elsewhere. It is known that the proposed waste mound would leak radioactive materials into the Ottawa River, our Kitchissippi. This is not acceptable to us. Algonquin and Anishinaabe people deem water sacred. It is the element of life that circulates through all living beings and ensures all life on Earth. We continue to prioritize protecting the Kitchissippi and its water, the sacred wealth, from any threat to its well-being. That is why we strongly oppose this ill-conceived plan and do not give our consent for its construction. Algonquin and Anishinaabe people are not alone in opposing this giant radioactive waste dump at Chalk River. Hundreds of civil society groups and individuals have spoken out against it. Over 150 municipalities have passed resolutions of concern or opposition, including Gatineau, Ottawa, and Montreal. And the Assembly of First Nations passed a resolution opposing the dump in 2018. So many voices are calling for a halt to this careless plan, but will we be heard? I sincerely hope so. And it's hard to even grasp the fact that this is a conversation that we need to have and a fight that we need to push forward with, and we just need to combine our collective efforts until the postponed hearing comes about. So until then, let's work together and rally to help put an end to this. Miigwech.
I'm going to now turn to, on the Zoom screen, we're joined virtually by Grand Chief Lisa Robinson, also Chief of the Wolf Lake First Nation. Turning to the screen, Chief Robinson.
Okay. Kwekakina, Lisa Nadijnikaz, Mongdo Dem, Megan Zagayigan, Nadojaba. Good morning, bon matin. Greetings to my colleagues and the leaders and to each and every one of you here today to hear our concerns. I am Chief Lisa Robinson of Wolf Lake First Nation and Grand Chief of the Algonquin Nation Secretariat, which includes the First Nations of Temiskaming, Wolf Lake, and the Algonquins of Barrier Lake. I bring to you greetings today from the top of the Gitchisibi at Temiskaming First Nation. The disposal of nuclear waste and its potential impact on Aboriginal rights is of great concern to the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. Future generations will have to contend with decisions being made today. You see, as leaders and people here today, it is our duty to preserve and protect Mother Earth for future generations. We cannot risk the destruction of Aki, Nibi, land and water, which are sustaining for all of the life beings. Protection of water is of the utmost importance to First Nations. Water is required for life, and therefore any disposal facilities must meet the highest standards of environmental and water protection. Yet, we have learned that the proposed near-surface disposal facility does not meet international safety standards. As an Anishinaabe Kwe, I carry with me great responsibility as a woman, as a mother, as a chief, as a leader, to protect the water today and for future generations to come. As women, we are responsible for the water teachings and the protection of water as it provides for all of creation. In Anishinaabe worldview, we have an inherent responsibility as the caretakers of the earth. And that inherent responsibility is one of our inherent Aboriginal rights, which are protected by the Canadian Constitution, Section 35. We support and recognize the declaration made by the Iroquois Caucus and Anishinaabe Nation in 2018. Their declaration on the transport and abandonment of radioactive waste had 5 key points, including no abandonment, better containment, more packaging, monitoring, retrievable storage, and away from water bodies. The near-surface disposal facility would fail to meet all of these key points, but most concerning is the close proximity of the proposed facility to the Gitchisibi, the Ottawa River, less than 1 kilometer. We do not agree with the near-surface disposal facility proposed on our tidal territory along the Ottawa River. Our nations have not been meaningfully consulted on this project, which will clearly impact our ability to exercise our Aboriginal and tidal rights. Meaningful consultation requires a process of seeking, discussing, and considering carefully the views of our members in a manner that is cognizant of our Anishinaabe values. Consultation with Canadian nuclear laboratories has been sorely inadequate. Despite this lack of consultation and accommodation, the nuclear regulator seems poised to approve the project without our nation's consent. We view this process as clearly inconsistent with the federal objective of advancing reconciliation and not in keeping with the Crown's duty to act honorable in all its dealings with Indigenous peoples. Miigwech, merci, thank you.
Merci et miigwech. I'll only add a few words. C'est clair qu'on doit souligner que
We will highlight that the Algonquin First Nations were not consulted in a significant way, not at all, and the nuclear industry, as always, believes that it has the power to require that the entire nation of Canada will accept nuclear risk. And in this case, is going to have a radioactive waste dump closer to the Ottawa River that is called in Algonquin the Gitchisibi River.
standing here in solidarity. I just want to underscore that when Canada said we believed that we would uphold the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to free, prior, and informed consent, I don't think we had in mind that SNC-Lavalin would once again get its way. By the way, SNC-Lavalin is the primary shareholder of Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. And thank you again to Chief Heyman, Chief White Duck, Chief McGregor, and Chief Robinson, and they're available for your questions.
We'll now proceed with the question period. As a reminder, one question, one follow-up. We'll start in the room, then go on Zoom. People on Zoom, it's now time to use the raise hand function if you have any question. Nous allons maintenant passer à la période de questions. Une question suivie. Nous allons commencer en salle et puis ensuite sur le Zoom. Les personnes sur le Zoom, si vous avez une question, utilisez la fonction main levée maintenant. Nous allons commencer par Fraser Needham, APTN.
Thank you. So I note that just from reading other media, that the hearings were paused last year to have, I guess, more consultation. Have you actually had any more consultation with the site holders since then, or is it just, what was the follow-up since then, I guess?
So the procedural order granted by the commission gave us 6 months extension for us to be able to review some of the material, do some of our own studies, and come back with, information. It became clear quite quickly that 6 months wasn't enough time. The amount of information that had been accumulated by CNSC over the course of the last 6.5 years related to this project indicated that we should have been consulted early on, and that didn't happen. And asking, us to do a full literature review plus our own studies within the 6, and with the granting of the extension 8 months was not realistic. But in that time frame, we were able to go in and do some studies on the ground. Being better consulted with by CNSC, that did not happen. I mean, we had challenges right from the get-go following the procedural order. We had challenges negotiating funding agreements, which took, time. When we were on site, staff were obstructionist, made it very difficult for us to do studies. So while we were able to do some work, it wasn't through any effort made by CNSC and the partners. We really took the opportunity that had been granted to us to try and bring forward, our greatest concerns. And we're here this morning to tell you that what we saw and what we are seeing are huge gaps in the amount of work and studies that should have been done, that were not done. And with our findings, we're realizing that there are huge gaps. And based on that reality, there's not an adequate time for us to have been consulted. Therefore, it's hard for us to make an informed decision and, provide consent. Yeah. So in essence, we did get the extension, but not quite enough time to do, the kind of consultation, the deep consultation that would have been required to meet the thresholds of the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous people.
Okay, and just as a follow-up, I guess a lot of the concern, of course, is the proximity, closeness to the Ottawa River. If this site was located further away or another area, would that be more acceptable, or is it just the basis of having nuclear waste site located on this land?
No, a big part of the issue is the proximity to the Ottawa River, and the fact that the nuclear waste that is already there is already, polluting and polluting the Ottawa River. If there was another site selection, again, we'd want to go through the full process of understanding and mitigating the potential impacts. But the problem with this particular project is that there was no alternative site presented. It was simply, here's where we think it is the best place. But were it to be moved away from the Kitchissippi and in an area where it would have less impact, we would most certainly, want to look at that. Because at the end of the day, I think we all have a responsibility to manage this waste. We just don't believe that it should be buried in a nuclear waste dump less than a kilometer from the Ottawa River.
Thank you. On va passer à Nelly Aberola de Radio.
Radio-Canada. Hello. I would like to know what was the follow-up. There will be a hearing on the 18th, and then what will happen?
Follow the following after that. What are you going to do with this? I know that there is something in August 10, so I was wondering what is the next step. Thank you.
There's an official hearing in August that obviously Chief Lance Heyman referred to that we have concerns about. This group, that's what they say is an arm's length from the government of Canada. Clearly it's not. It's the federal government has the fiduciary obligation to consult with First Nations, not an arm's length corporation that assumes that responsibility. It works. This whole process has been working backwards. You have an organization that wants to have this happen, yet they're the ones steering the consultation process and steering the hearing and steering this. So there's not a third-party body that's moving this forward. It's all this one organization, which is totally flawed. It's a true David versus Goliath story in terms of First Nations versus a group that had worked on this for many, many years, and we were only given 6 months. And the fact that they want to have this hearing by virtual means is very disgusting. In the reality that there is no more COVID, we had to do this hearing during COVID last year, and we just don't understand why the hearing is held virtually. It just doesn't make sense. You know, we had this opposition. We had this hearing last year in person, and it's just flawed, this whole process. And like I mentioned earlier, it's Canadians, and Chief Heyman referred this. Canadians and the citizens of Ottawa should be scared of this. I'm very shocked that the citizens of Ottawa are not aware of this. I speak to many citizens of Ottawa, and they never heard of a nuclear waste disposal 2 hours away from their home here. You asked the Prime Minister himself, would you drink the water from the Ottawa River? Would you let your kids swim in the Ottawa River with a nuclear waste disposal? Would you let all the MPs that sit in the House of Commons, would you swim in the water knowing that there's actually a nuclear waste disposal and a store and waste disposal right around the corner? We have legitimate concerns about this. We've been here for millennial, the Algonquin Nation and our people. We're still here, and we're going to be here for another 1,000 years. We don't want to deal with this contaminants that will be poured into our river, the Ottawa River, the Kitchissippi, the Great River. That we have so much history with this river. So much history is embedded in in our history as the Algonquin people in this river, and it's unfortunate. But you know, they are putting this here and they're slamming it down our throats, and we have nothing to do that we can stop this.
Maybe one more question. I know that you are working of a kind of project of protection of nature. I was wondering, does it mean that now the only choice is to protect the Ottawa River as well, like injustice, protection?
All across Canada, we're hearing rivers are getting protection. They're getting names. They're getting identity. The Ottawa River is one of the most historic rivers in this country. One of the most historic rivers in this country, and this river deserves that same entitlement as other rivers across Canada. And I defer to Chief Robinson for additional comments with regards to a name and keeping it sacred.
Yes, absolutely. The Gitchissippi, we are the people of the Gitchissippi as Anishinaabe Algonquin. And, in our worldview, it is our responsibility to ensure the protection of that water and also the land with it, because in balance, those two aspects provide for all of our are all of life and all of creation and what's that which sustains us. So the protection of water is absolutely of the utmost importance for First Nations, but should be prioritized for everybody. Without water, you don't have life. And that's what it is at the end of the day is, having that responsibility and sharing that responsibility with everyone throughout our lands and territory and beyond. So for us, it's interesting, to see some of the newer aspects, providing personhood to water in terms of the legal realm. And it's that essence and that spirit, that is tied to our ceremonies and our culture and our identity and our place names and the place where we come from. Our community of Wolf Lake is named after water. And that is part of our identity and culture as Anishinaabe people from Wolf Lake. And that's reflected in that. And behind me, you see, this is the Gitchisibi, the Ottawa River, which is so important to all of our people, but also for all people of all of our nations here in Canada. Miigwech.
Thank you. Next question, Mario from National Observer. So I'm just kind of curious about the kind of shady consultation process. You mentioned Pikwakanagan gave consent. I know a number of years ago, Algonquins of Ontario were involved too. They even named a building at CNL. I'm just wondering, has there been renewed conversations with Pikwakanagan? Is Algonquins of Ontario still involved in this process of consultation? And then maybe comment on, what it's like to kind of have CNL pick and choose which Algonquins give consent.
So your questions had many parts. So in terms of Pikwakanagan's, involvement with the project, we were only informed just prior to the announcement by the new chief, Mr. Sarazan. He wanted to give us a heads up, knowing that our position was directly in contrast, to the position of Pikwakanagan. Again, we're troubled by that decision. We're on the ground. We're seeing the impacts on the fauna, on the wildlife, on the area. And, they have people who are supposed to be in there, and they have to be observing the same issues as we do. What we just see, is a continuation of colonialism. Governments or their entities have learned that, dangle a carrot, conquer and divide, offer something to one that is not afforded to the other, and create division. This is a prime example, of that happening. The sad part is that, it's a First Nation who seem to have forgotten, their responsibilities and their priorities as we've just described to you. Protectors of the land, protectors of the water, to give that all up and provide consent to a nuclear waste dump in exchange for a few baubles and the potential jobs. And read the press release, it speaks to, we will have a say in terms of the monitoring and eventual other projects that are online there. Again, smoke and mirrors. Unfortunately, baffled by promises of employment, of being able to monitor. What they've essentially consented to is watching, the continued and increased pollution of the Ottawa River that this facility is going to do over the next 50, 100 years if this near-surface disposal facility is allowed to be built. It already is leaching radioactive pollution into the Ottawa River. CNSC and all of its partners are downplaying this. They will tell you that we're going to put in a treatment system, we're going to deal with issues, we're going to mitigate. You cannot mitigate the impacts of nuclear waste. It was mentioned we are responsible for the protection and we work to strive, in protecting for the next 7 generations. It's almost impossible for us to do this in this case because the waste that is being generated is going to have an impact on 30,000 generations. So how do you reconcile, our need to do protection of the environment and water, and we are looking at a 7-generation horizon when we know what they're burying in this mound and in the deep geological repository that's being proposed for high-level waste in the Ojibwe territory in Northern Ontario. It's not good. It's going to poison the territory. It's a challenge. And that's the reality we face. So, in the interim, we're going to do what we need to do. We're going to try and educate Canadians leading up to the formal hearing where we will present, our findings. And our joint submissions are available in the public domain, so I would encourage you to go out and read them as well. They really speak, to what we've seen, what we heard, what we saw. I'll talk a little bit to the lady's question. Going forward, once we have the hearing, in the event that CNSC comes forward and issues approval, for the construction of NSDF, we most certainly going to have to explore what other opportunities are there, because I've just described that consultation has not worked. It will fail, and this government has no problem, promoting on one hand, the importance of UNDRIP, but disregarding it when it's convenient for them. It's the sad state of affairs. So we'll also look at what our legal options are in terms of judicial reviews and other mechanisms. Again, I think we can demonstrate that we have been inadequately consulted, and watching proponents pick and choose who benefits, who doesn't. For me, it's just a continuation of colonialism, and it's really sad to see that the people of PIC and their leadership have chosen, to give consent to a project, because when we've consulted our people, the message we got was loud and clear. You need to do whatever you need to do to protect the water. That's why we're here.
Just one follow-up. I'm just wondering then, was PIC given the same amount of time for consultations, or are you aware that they were consulted many months, even years prior?
It would appear that PIC has had an ongoing relationship with CNSC and CNL and AECL through their involvement and partnership with the Algonquins of Ontario. For the most part, they are still one and the same. So, as you mentioned, they named a building. And so PIC's relationship has been longer, but they did not present, in Pembroke last fall, they did not ask the commission for more time to be consulted. They already had their own process. And, it took every bit of effort on the part of Kitigan, ZB, and Quebec to convince the commission that the CNSC had not done its job in consultation, because simply they had referenced, we sent an email, we, called, but never formally, tried to engage us. Lots of effort's been done in the last 6 months, but you know what? We missed out on 6.5 years. It's, somewhat too little, too late.
I think, Lisa, you might have something to add?
Thank you, Miigwech. Merci. I think just to reiterate this consultation and with different Indigenous groups, I think at the end of the day, we can all agree that what we're seeing is that, this whole aspect of Canadian nuclear laboratories, them being the nuclear regulator, they're in a position where they're poised to move ahead with this project, regardless of anybody's consent at this point. And we can all, talk about how, this consultation process with all the different nations has been, sorely inadequate. And that is something that we can all agree on at this point, I believe. And I think that's something that, really has to be stated and put on the record. And it's important. because this involves all of us. Miigwech.
Thank you. Next question, Greg Newing from the Pontiac Journal.
Hi. So Chief White Duck spoke a bit about the potential impacts on the Ottawa-Gatineau area, and I think one of the general messages has been that this is not just the concern of Algonquin First Nations, but all of us sharing this land. So my question, I write for the Pontiac Journal, and just a simple question: what might be some of the impacts on the Pontiac area from this side of? If any of you could speak a bit to it, thanks.
Just because there's a line that says Ontario and Quebec doesn't mean that the impacts on the Quebec side will not be felt. It's the same impacts that will be felt on the other side as well. You got to imagine that our people didn't imagine there was a line there. That's an imaginary line for our people, and the fact of the Algonquin people and the Anishinaabe. It's an imaginary line. That's all it is. It's just a colonial boundary that separates Quebec and Ontario. That river is on both shores of Quebec and on Ontario. And Quebec's not even the municipalities all along the river there are not even being included in any dialogue. So I think there's a misunderstanding. Just because it's on one side of the river, it's not like the other side is going to be impacted. It's going to be impacted greatly. And the city of Gatineau too, another growing city that's flourishing quite well in my opinion. And those residents too are not being involved in this particular matter. So there's a lot of distrust. I'm very disappointed that the media has not catch on to this more, because you are our allies in this case. You have to be our allies in this case. So we have to raise that awareness so that citizens that live along the other side of on the Quebec side are aware of this. And I don't think they're aware of this. I'll be quite frank. I think they hear, but I don't think they're properly involved at any degree.
Thank you.
Yeah, follow up, Greg?
Yeah, maybe just one follow-up, and Chief McGregor also mentioned this as well, that there has been collaboration with municipalities, from what I understand from what Chief White Duck is saying, that must mean that it's been a bit more on the Ontario side. So I don't know if anybody could speak to potential ways that municipalities on the Quebec side could collaborate, could get involved.
I guess we just have to revisit and revive the conversations that were had in the past. With so much going on in the world, it's hard to keep abreast onto everything that's happening, but it's so important that we work together. And again, there's no clear path on a nuclear road. I made a statement in the past in regards to that building that was named in Anishinaabe, and I actually met the individual who got asked via Facebook how to say what this word was in Anishinaabe, and that individual didn't even realize the impact. So it shows like they're appropriating our culture, our identity, our nationhood, and what First Nations community has the ability to just make bids for the Ottawa Senators with all this money that we don't have when we live under the Indian Act. And there's just layers of complexity and red tape everywhere. And we just need to get the truth out there so then we can engage in the right movements to put a stop to this.
So I would just like to mention that, look, in the Renfrew area, I mean, the issue is fairly well known. There are a number of non-Indigenous groups who are actively, opposing this project and bringing information to their populations. They have been allies, to the Algonquins in this process, in helping educate us as to, their concerns. They're making it known that they want to be involved and support us, and us actively using these groups, to facilitate getting information out. And I think, over the course of the next 7 weeks or 6 weeks leading up to the hearing on August the 10th, that is going to be our primary focus, is educating the non-Indigenous population in and along the Kichisibi, whether it be in Quebec or in Ontario, as to the potential impacts of the NSDF, what it's already doing, and the potential that it has to impact all of our lives in the future. If you take a look at our booklet and you take a look at, some of the animals that we're seeing there, the sick moose, the contaminated vegetation, the tritium levels in Perch Creek, which is leaching into the Ottawa River, we should all be sitting up and taking note, because this project will have huge impacts. It'll have impacts on the fauna, it'll have impacts on the land, it will have impacts on the animal, on the winged creatures, on the insects, the frogs. CNL speaks highly of their work to protect turtles, but again, that's their vision of protection. What we see when we go there is we see a trap that they've created, which, forces the turtles to be stuck in one place where they're easily predated by species who depend on them. And, they're surprised when they're tracking receivers on these turtles, go dead because they believe that, they've done a great job. Western science and traditional knowledge has a role to play. What we see a lot of with NSDF is Western science. What's really lacking is when we go in and we get on the ground, there's a basis for us to provide, traditional knowledge as well, which is just as important and just as vital as Western science. So we may look at the same issue, but we're completely looking at it in different lenses. But we want to thank and acknowledge the strong support that we've got from our non-Indigenous allies as we bring forward these concerns. As we mentioned, it's not only us who are concerned as Algonquin people, but we're concerned by the millions of people who are already drinking this water, and who it's only going to get progressively worse over the next 50, 100,000 years, while this mound, continues to create havoc. We'll all be dust, and my children and my grandchildren and their grandchildren will be still suffering the consequences of a decision today to build a nuclear waste dump, 1 kilometer from the Ottawa River. It's totally insane. It doesn't make sense. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Last question, Kirsten from APTN. No question. Perfect. So that will conclude the press conference for today. Thank you all.
Make which